This topic is near and dear to my heart. I've shared with you previously that I'm a bit of a brain nerd. We're going to geek out on brain stuff. We're going to talk about working memory, why it's important. Like we do in our other sessions, we'll keep it pretty fast-paced, pretty lively, but most importantly, by the time you walk away from this session, you'll have specific strategies you can use with your kids that you can actually use either in an online or an in-person variation. They work in lots of different ways. We're going to talk about what working memory is, why it matters, and how you can improve it. So for those of you who like to see some sort of an agenda, here's what we'll attempt to tackle. You guys are the gifted group, so we'll go pretty quickly, but you'll have this as a backup. You'll be able to go back and view the video. You have my handouts, and then you have access to me any way I can support you going forward if you wanted to revisit any of these topics. So that's what we'll try to tackle during this 1 hour session. Here's the way we'll look at this concept of working memory. There's a series of skills that kids need in order to be successful in school. You can see some of those listed there on the screen. These are what are commonly referred to as executive function skills. They're life skills. But another way to look at it is this. If you have a child that you're working with, or an adult for that matter, that struggles in one or more of these things, focusing their attention, processing incoming data, putting things in order, you name it. Excuse me while I admit a couple more people into our session. When you have students or people in your life who struggle with these things in one form or another, life's going to be tough, much less school. School's going to be tough. In order for kids to be successful in school and in life, they need what we call executive function skills. That's kind of a broad overarching category. We're going to talk about just one subset or one form of an executive function skill, and that's working memory, and we'll define that here in just a moment. What's so interesting about executive functions is that when they're absent, they really become invisible. We don't ever think about it. For example, let's say you're a 5th grade teacher and you have a kid that is age appropriate, able to process information, and age appropriate, able to focus their attention, and has a pretty decent working memory, whatever that is. We'll define that here in just a moment. If you have an age appropriate 5th grader who can do some of these things, you don't even think about it. They're probably fairly successful in school. They're probably fairly successful in their grades and completing assignments. These skills, when they're present, appropriate for the age, of course, they just become invisible. It's when they're absent that we then start to think, okay, we got an issue. For example, if a kid can't pay attention very well, then we think, oh no, are they ADD, or is there something else going on? If they can't defer gratification, we think, uh-oh, something else is going on. These skills are so important, but we often don't think about it until they're absent, and then they become present. Is that a weird way to say it? When they're absent, when these things are there, then we have to start dealing with it. That's the issue. We're going to talk about just one subset of these executive function skills, and that's this idea of working memory. First, let's start by giving it a pretty good definition. Up on the screen, you see a pretty decent definition. It's not the same as short-term memory. We'll differentiate between short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory. This is a foundational ability. A foundational skill is simply this: your ability as a human being to take some information, a small amount of information for a limited period of time, plop it into what we call working memory. A good analogy for working memory is it's a bit like your brain's Post-it note. It's where you put a temporary amount of information so you can deal with it. It's your memory in action. It's the process of thinking and processing what's immediately in front of you. We call that working memory. You can think of it like this. Working memory is called working memory because we have to work on something. It's the memory in action. It's different than just remembering stuff. It's actually manipulating stuff. In fact, that's some of the key words. If you're a note taker or an underliner or a highlighter, here's some things you might want to take a look at. Working memory is our ability to manipulate, hold on to, and manipulate and work on information. Typically in a pretty short period of time, typically pretty small amounts of information. It's what you do with now in the present. It's different than short-term memory. We'll dig into that here as well. Here's the base of what you need to know. Like I said, we're going pretty quickly, but you guys are the gifted group. Working memory, first off, is temporary. It's not designed to be long-term memory. Long-term memory, that's a discussion we can have if you're interested. How do we get our kids to remember stuff in the long-term memory? That's a whole nother series of workshops. But it's in the temporary, what information do I put into my brain in order to manipulate, work on, figure it out, create a solution, problem solve? It's temporary. It's limited. My working memory becomes overwhelmed pretty quickly. You can't give me too much information to manipulate, otherwise I just lose it. It's not synonymous with short-term memory. Once again, I will tell you what that means. It consists of only two things. This is an important thing, and we'll talk about this when it comes to strategies. It really consists of just two things: sights, what we see, and what we hear. There's no evidence that you have a taste working memory or a tactile working memory. Of your five senses, working memory is just two things: sights and sounds. And in order to manipulate, hold on, work on something, it requires that you focus your attention. So here is that key idea. Take a look, then we'll do one deeper dive via an analogy, two analogies actually, and then we'll figure out where we go from there. This stuff is cool. I love this stuff. Working memory is simply this. When you're presented with some information, either a sight or a sound, that your brain needs to figure out, okay, what do I do with this? How do I create an outcome? How do I problem solve? What do I do? How do I work on it? That's working memory, which is not the same as just remembering something. If you just have to remember something for a short period of time, that's called short-term memory. They're not synonymous. They're similar, but they're not synonymous. Here's an example. If I tell you this, by the time our session's done at 5 o'clock, when 5 o'clock rolls around, there's one word that I want you to remember: hippopotamus. That's it. All you have to do is plop that piece of information, that one singular word, into short-term memory, and then in about 50 minutes, recall it. You don't have to do anything with it. You don't have to create a problem or solve a problem with it. You don't have to work around it or manipulate it. You just simply have to remember it. Here's a difference. If I were to say, by the time we're done, you're not going to be allowed to leave at 5 o'clock until you tell me the names of three animals that you would find on the African safari and how they interact with each other. See, that requires that you take some information, three animals, African safari, how they interact, and then I have to kind of solve a problem with it. That's working memory, because you have to do something. Short-term memory only requires that you remember something. Working memory requires you cognitively deal with it. As that promised analogy, here's the way to look at it. So here's the first analogy. If you text somebody in your family and say, hey, I'm on my way home, I'm going to run by Starbucks, do you want anything? And they say yes. Actually, imagine it's a phone call, not a text. They say, yeah, absolutely. Please get me a mocha frappuccino with no whipped cream. That's just short-term memory. All you have to remember is mocha frappuccino, no whipped cream. Two pieces of information, no big deal. But if they tell you, yeah, you know what, I'm craving something chocolatey, but I don't want a lot of calories. Why don't you just look at the menu and just figure it out? Then you have to remember two things: chocolatey, not a lot of calories. Then you have to take those two pieces of information, only two pieces of information, just like short-term memory. The first example was remember two pieces: mocha frappuccino and no whipped cream. This time you have to take two pieces of information and manipulate and use them in order to solve a problem. It's not the same as just remembering mocha frappuccino, no whipped cream. You have to remember, okay, chocolatey and not a lot of calories. Then you have to look at the menu and think, okay, those are my criteria. Do you have to remember that criteria in 2 weeks? Probably not. It's only short term, just like short-term memory. Working memory is short. You don't have to remember it long term. Unless that same person gives you the same directions every single day, then that's another issue. Another issue or another analogy that might work is this. If you text somebody or call someone and say, hey, I'm heading home, I'm going to go by the grocery store, what do we need? And they say, oh, we just need milk, eggs, and cheese. That's short-term memory, three things you got to remember. But if they say this, then it becomes working memory. If they say something like, you know what, we have dry spaghetti noodles and pork chops, figure out everything else we need for a nice meal. Then I have to remember two things: dry spaghetti noodles and pork chops. Then I have to take that same amount of information or a similar amount of information, just two things, and then figure out how do I solve a problem with it. Now, you can start to see the connection in the classroom. Often we tell students, here's just something you need to remember, that's short term. But we often give them directions, guidance, facts, information that they have to put into working memory in order to solve a problem with it. And when they can't or when they struggle, then it looks often like willful misconduct or disengagement or lack of motivation or laziness or stalling. It looks like these behaviors, some kids, it might be they're just struggling to figure it all out. They have a working memory deficit. In fact, sometimes the behaviors we see are actually more working memory deficit than they are willful misconduct kind of behaviors. So short-term memory, working memory, long-term memory. Working memory, short-term memory, they're not synonymous. They hold some things in common. But without a good working memory, it's hard to get stuff into long-term memory. The good news is I wouldn't be offering this session for you if we couldn't improve it. So I'm going to show you strategies you can use with kids in order to improve working memory, in order to have kids be successful and remember and develop skills, remember things and develop skills. If you want your students to take that information and manipulate it, do something with it, solve a problem with it, then it's working memory. It's not just short-term memory. Now, I mentioned they have some things in common, but they're not exactly synonymous. Here are some of those things in common. Both short-term memory and long-term, or short-term and working memory, have limitations in time. The working memory is a bit like your brain's Post-it note. If you have Post-it notes in front of you, the design of a Post-it note is it's designed to be used once and thrown away. You probably are not writing your doctoral dissertation on Post-it notes. They're temporary. They're temporary in use. They don't stick around for a long time. They're not designed to. There's a limitation in capacity. Now, there's different studies that suggest different things, but how much can you put into working memory? It actually can improve as you get older, but somewhere between 3 and 5, maybe as many as 7 items or pieces of information can go into working memory. This immediately tells you this, both short-term and working memory. If you're standing up in front of students and you give them directions that are multiple part directions, if you get up in front of your students and say something like this, you say, students, welcome to class. As you know, we're working on our project. We're doing our diorama for our book report. Don't forget to use the rubric. Don't forget your materials are over there. You have to work with your partner and get feedback from 3 other people. And I'm guilty of that. We probably all are. We provide way too many verbal directions and their working memory becomes overloaded. And then if we don't realize that we've probably overloaded their working memory, and then they come up and ask us what's next, we say, weren't you paying attention? I just told you that. And we kind of get judgmental when we realize it might have actually been us. We're guilty of giving them way too much verbal information that overwhelms working memory. And you can see here are some examples of capacity limitations. If I ask you what's 12 minus 4, just process that in your brain. What's 12 minus 4? You would say 8. That's pretty easy. That's only 2 pieces of information. If I add a third, it gets a little bit harder. If I ask you what's 12 minus 7 plus 9, you would say, okay, 12 minus 7, that's 5 plus 14. Okay. It takes a little bit longer when you add on there, but if I were to ask you this, you'd think, okay, where's my calculator? Working memory capacity can be overwhelmed pretty easily. Now, could you do this in your brain if I gave you enough time and I said, no pens, no pencils, no calculators? Could you do it? Probably. Would you have like total confidence in your answer? It's like, oh, I think I'm pretty close. Some of you could estimate pretty quickly. You would round and then you'd estimate. That would be a lot easier. But when it comes to capacity and as a limitation, it gets overwhelmed pretty quickly. So again, quick summary, short term, you just hold on to stuff. Working memory, you have to hold on to it and manipulate it. That's the key idea. That's our key takeaway. We have to understand what working memory is. And I mentioned earlier, it just consists of 2 things, what we see and what we hear. And it's held on to for just moments or just seconds or minutes in order to be processed in the brain. And that other analogy works pretty well. Tracy Alloway, who is, I think, in my opinion, the leading researcher in this world of working memory, has written several books on working memory, but that's a wonderful one. She just says this: it's your brain's Post-it note. Where are you going to put a small amount of information for a short period of time in order to deal with it, to create an outcome, to solve a problem, to complete a task? And once that task is completed, we throw the note away. Because most of what goes into working memory, what we manipulate, is for the purpose of solving a problem more than anything else. An immediate problem. It's our memory in action. That's an easy way to think about it as well. All right, so how important is working memory? It's audience participation time. Here you go. 4 statements up on the screen. You don't need to use the chat feature. You certainly can if you like. Those statements, there are either true or false. I'll give you a hint. At least one of them is false. See if you can figure out which one is which. So let's see how you did. Let's start at the bottom and work from bottom to top. Effective working memory skills are a greater indicator of academic success than IQ. That's true. So if you think about it, if you are a kindergarten teacher, for example, and you have a kid who struggles with working memory, means they struggle to hold on to verbal directions for very long, even one step at a time, you're thinking, oh man, that's going to have a big impact on their behavior and their academic success, isn't it? So the bottom one is true. The middle one is true as well. There's connections between disabilities such as ADD. Number 2, or the second one from the top, that one's the actual one that's false. It's not twice, it's 5 times. So I tricked you a little bit there. It's kind of true, but it's actually 5 times. Kindergarten students with poor working memory are 5 times more likely to struggle in math. Why is that? You think about all of the working memory requirements in order to solve a problem in front of me. Is I have to take, okay, this minus this, or this plus this, or quantity. If I struggle with working memory, math is really hard. And number 1 is true as well. And I shared this with you just to point out that this topic is pretty darn important. It ought to get our attention. So working memory, it is what drives our comprehension. It's what drives thinking and comprehension. It's really required for doing just about everything else. For example, if I'm working on delaying gratification or deferring gratification, I have to kind of have some things up there that I'm working on and thinking about. If you support any students that struggle with, their family struggle with income, or what you may or may not label as poverty, there's evidence that suggests that as well. Students in poverty have weaker working memory. There's a variety of reasons for that. And the good news is we can actually help our students get much better. If you're interested in the science and the background of this stuff, there's tons and tons of it. If you know what effect sizes are, effect sizes merely measure outcome or power or an effect of something. And at the elementary school level, there's a 1.4 effect size. What does that mean? It's massive. The higher the number, the better when it comes to an effect size. And most researchers suggest that somewhere around a 0.4 to a 0.5 is about a year's worth of growth. So if something has a 1.4 effect size, we're talking, let's push in 3 years. It's a little less, there's a wider variation at the secondary level, but this stuff matters. And there's tons and tons of evidence that suggests the same thing. If you want some of that evidence, let me know and I'll forward it to you. I'm just sharing, let you know that there's good background. So in the rest of our time, we just get to talk about what the heck do we do about it. Here's the cool part of our program is what the heck do we do if some of our students are struggling in working memory. We do 2 things. 1, we reduce cognitive load. I'll show you ways to do that. And number 2, we build cognitive capacity. So let's jump right in. We're making great use of our time. Quick review before we do so. Pause, take a moment, see if you can figure out what words go in each of those 6 blank lines. Feel free to use the chat feature if you'd like, but it's not required. So here are your answers. When working memory works pretty well for us, or it's proficient, it's primarily invisible. We don't even think about it. Number 2, it is the primary difference between short-term and working is that working memory requires that we hold and manipulate or work on. Either one word would have gone in just fine there. It has its limitations in 2 things, how much time we can devote to it and capacity. It just consists of sights and sounds. And then it's a little like the brain's Post-it note. That's a pretty good analogy. And there's a tremendous correlation in the research between working memory and reading and math scores. So what you might have put in there is math scores. That would have worked there just fine. So two things you can do. You can reduce cognitive load, and that is the amount of load we're placing into working memory, and then we could build capacity. And in all reality, before we talk about these strategies, each of those red check marks are strategies. Before we talk about these, we really do them simultaneously. We both reduce cognitive load and we build capacity at the same time. The good news is working memory can be improved. If you're working with this child right now who is struggling with what you might suspect are working memory deficits, then the first thing we do is kind of reduce the amount of load we're putting in their brains in the first place. I'll show you how to do that. And then simultaneously, we're working on building their capacity to get a little bit better at it. So 5 ways we can reduce cognitive load. Let's jump right in. Here's the first one, is we provide visual supports. Here's the big idea. Let me pause for a moment, allow you to read that on your own. So we provide lots of visuals, lots of external supports. Here are examples, lots of external supports. Sometimes they're in the form of directions or steps that students need to take. Instead of just relying on the words, we put visual supports out there as well. So we not only verbally remind them, here are the steps you need to take. You see steps there, that's probably for a primary classroom. In more of an intermediate classroom there on the right. We provide anchors, steps. We reduce cognitive load. Instead of having them just rely on what we're telling them, the words, we're giving them the external steps. Why do we do that? Because it's not so much important that they remember the steps. They do the steps in order to produce something or solve a problem. The reason we're providing those steps 1 through 4 is so they can be productive. What you see there on the left, rather 1 through 5, is so that they can be productive in the environment and learn. The reason we provide them something like those anchor charts is to free up cognitive space, in essence, in order to focus on solving the problem. A couple of other examples of how we might go about doing that. We do these things because the steps aren't as important as the outcome, which would be the learning. Is we're freeing up cognitive capacity. We're freeing up the load replacing and working memory so that they can use the working memory capacity they do have in order to solve the academic problem rather than the process problem. And you see a lot of your kids really get those mixed up, don't they? We sometimes give them so many verbal directions that their working memory is focused on, okay, what's first, what's next, what do I do then? When in reality, those steps aren't as important. The steps are only serving a purpose. The purpose is in order to produce something that's of value, something that your students can learn from. That's really the purpose. And there's some other examples, just lots of other examples we can pull from. Here, some more. So we externalize information in order to help our students with steps. And in case you think this is just something we do for kids, hello, we have externalized information for us all the time in order to free up capacity to focus on what's most important. They post speed limit signs in your neighborhood. Now, could someone have an argument with you and say, let's say it was a 25, supposed to post a speed limit down the neighborhood in your street. Most residential streets is 25 or 35. Let's say you violated that and you were going 47 in a 35. You get pulled over by the police officer, right? The police officer could realistically and legally tell you, you should know, because in residential neighborhoods, it's either 25 or 35. You have a driver's license. It's your job to know this. You should know that. But the government is also nice enough to say, let's remind them in case they forget. We all benefit from reminders. Since I travel a lot, well, I haven't traveled a ton in the last 6 to 8 months, but previously, prior to COVID, I traveled a lot. I would be on an airplane several times a month, and the TSA does the same thing. They externalize information, even though when I click online to make that reservation, that reservation for a flight, it says all that stuff in there. It's all the stuff you click past that you don't read. But should I know that I'm only supposed to have these limitations when I check luggage? Well, I should, because it was put elsewhere, but they're nice enough to remind me. So we find these kind of external supports all over the place. A couple other ways we can do that are the what's done posters. A lot of teachers use those. Timers are a great source of externalizing information for our kids. A couple of weeks ago when we were together, I shared that website with you, classroomscreen.com, where you can pull in those countdown timers and you can put in directions and reminders about noise levels and reminders about if they're supposed to work together or by themselves. Those are just nice ways to externalize information. In order to reduce cognitive load, we provide external information. Here's the second way we can go about doing that, and that is to chunk information. We all know what chunking is. You probably do lots and lots of chunking, but in order to dig into it just a little bit deeper and figure out how it connects to the brain, question for you. How many numbers are in your phone number? Think about that for just a moment. How many numbers are in your phone number? So let me rephrase the question. I did not ask you how many digits are in your phone number. Catherine, I think you got where I was going on this. I did not ask you how many digits were in your phone number. I asked you how many numbers are in your phone number. And depending on how you answer that, it's either 3 or 2. See, the brain likes to naturally chunk information into small pieces. So I live in area code 520. If somebody asks me my phone number, I give them 3 numbers if they don't know that I live in Arizona in 520. So I say it's 520. 560, that's the next number, and then the dash 8488, that's the last number. It's actually 3 numbers spread across. If you add the area code in there, plus the 1, could be as many as 10. Those are digits. See, the brain just naturally does this, and it's easier to remember when we chunk things out. So one of the ways we can reduce cognitive load, you're probably already doing this to support your kids, is to provide lots of chunked information. Now, the example you see on the screen comes from a couple of good friends of mine. If you've not heard of Leanne and Melissa before, that book came out not too long ago, less than a year ago, I think, and it's just really, really good. It's just a wonderful book. They have a whole section of how do you chunk information. They're not the ones who designed it in the first place. They just capitalized on it. The instructional cha-chas, that's what they call the cha-chas, are chunk, chew, check, change. So you chunk information, knowing that the brain likes small, digestible pieces of information. You chunk it, allow students to chew on it, then you check how they're chewing, and then you change or adjust if needed. So you see the example they provided there in the middle of the screen. Chunking information is just easier for your brain to remember. Rather, in this case, what you see on the screen, rather than remembering, what are there, 8 states, you divide 2 categories for each. 2 categories are easier to remember than 8 discrete pieces of information. The brain just naturally likes to chunk information, and it makes a lot of sense. So we reduce cognitive load. A couple ways we can do that. We chunk information, we provide external sources of information, and we provide one verbal direction at a time. Thus make the connections. Take a look and see what you see, read what you see on the screen. Every single one of us have done this. Stand up in front of a group of kids and you give them verbal directions, maybe too many verbal directions. I'm guilty of this early on in my career when I didn't know this stuff. And I give them 4, 5, 6, 7 part directions. And then I say, okay, I just told you what to do, now go. And they'd stand around and just like, huh? And then early on, in my career, I kind of got a little irritated. It's like, I just told you. Just telling kids you already know this, sometimes it's just a sieve. It just goes through as quickly as it comes in. In order to avoid the what are we supposed to be doing look, we give one part directions, one piece at a time. We don't have a ton of time to go into the key features you see on the left, but let me give you a quick overview of what that is. When I train teachers, especially newer teachers, this is what I tell them. First, plant your feet. Go to a direction spot in your classroom that your kids are going to be trained that when I'm here, this is about me giving you direct information that you need to understand. Plant your feet. Don't wander around and give directions while you're roaming around the room. If you do that, you're training your kids to ignore you because it helps when you look at the person who's giving you directions. And if sometimes you're over there, sometimes you're over there, sometimes you're over there, kids aren't going to track you. So I go to my direction spot and I plant my feet. I use a credible voice as opposed to a begging voice or a pleading voice or a question. I use a credible voice, which is always kind, but it's direct. I gain their attention through some sort of an attention signal because I want them looking at me, because sometimes my directions are reinforced by my facial expressions, my body language, and then I give one piece of information at a time. I seek clarification, of course, in order to avoid the look from the little girl you see there on the screen. Can't overemphasize this enough. When you're supporting your colleagues, especially newer teachers, train them to give one verbal direction at a time. Does it take longer? Yes, but you are going to have a much better outcome for your kids. So a couple of ideas to add to that. Take a look at the screen with one direction at a time. I wish we had more time to go into this. Trust me on this one, your brain can't multitask. If we had more time, we'd do a deeper dive into this concept, but your brain cannot do more than one thing at a time. Well, can you walk and chew gum at the same time? Sure, but only one of those is cognitive. Only one of those is you're thinking about only one of them. That's the conversation, the talking. Knowing that your brain cannot multitask, it can only do one cognitive task at a time, I'm going to give my students one thing at a time to do. This is the science behind one at a time, because your brain cannot multitask. For example, I can either have my students writing and taking notes, or I can be talking, but they cannot be doing both at the same time. You've experienced that. Go remember college? Assuming you went to sort of a traditional college where you sat in a lecture hall and the professor was giving a lecture and you were supposed to take notes at the same time. So the professor said something and you thought to yourself, oh, that's pretty smart. And then you start writing it down. By the time you're done writing, the professor's on to like 3 points later and you miss it. You can't multitask. There's a lot of applications. I'll just talk about one of those. Here's one of the ways we often distract our own kids. They're with I like the way you statements. So here's an example. Let's say you get your students focused on a writing task. And this is a traditional classroom example, I get that. But you get your kids going on a writing task. Then you wander around the classroom and you're finding you're just giving feedback, right? So you're wandering around the classroom and they say, students, I really like the way Marco is writing very neatly. Remember to write neatly. Okay, go back to work. And then you're wandering around more and then you say, students, don't forget to, we do a lot of the don't forget tos. Students, don't forget to use your rubric. It's important that you use your rubric. Okay, now get back to work. Think about you're splitting their attention each and every time you do that. It's better to give them one direction at a time, let them do it. When it's time to move on, give them another single direction at a time. Pretty important idea. And then the last one in reducing cognitive load, I think this is our last one, provide them lots of checklists. We've talked in previous sessions about the power of checklists to probably enhance dopamine. Checklists are a nice way to reduce cognitive load. Say, do this. Once you're done with that, you do this. Once you're done with that, you do this. Checklist is a way to self-assess and keep your progress going, is a great tool. And they release that dopamine. Oh, I do have one more. I thought that was number 5. Here is number 5 on how we reduce cognitive load. And that is take a look at the clutter factor in their environment. Now, this is a traditional classroom environment, but I know we'll be back to normal before too long. That's my prayer anyway. And that is to remove the clutter, the visual clutter, and to a certain extent, the noise clutter in the environment. When there's too much visual clutter, it actually leads to what one researcher called environmental dysregulation. You can see that citation there on the bottom. Now, that study was done with cubicle workers, adults in an office environment in the cubicle world, and they found this. People who had messier desks were less proficient. It turns out that organization makes a big difference. For example, have you ever seen classrooms like this? Hopefully that's not one of yours. I see some of you over there smiling. Now, in all honesty, I just stole these right off the interweb, so who knows who these are. But if you look at the one on the left, that's like, that's a hoarder right there. I don't even know how to describe that. But that classroom that you see on the right, I have seen that kind of classroom, I don't know, way too many times. Put yourself in the position of a student who might be struggling with, working memory and focus. Put them in that environment. It's like, well, it's amazing kid can get anything done in that environment. Clear the clutter. Now, I'm not suggesting that we have sterile classrooms that are lacking personality and vibrant colors, but sometimes it's just too much. Here's an example. That's actually my desk that you're looking at right there. Both the left and the right, that's my desk. That's where I'm sitting right now. The one on the left, if I were to walk into my office in the morning and I see that, the one on the left, that's full of a ton of distractions. That's a hard place to get work done. But if I'm sit down and I'm at an environment that looks like the one on the right, it's a little bit easier to focus on a task when I clear the clutter. That's something we can help our students do as well. All right, there's that quick review. Take a moment, see if you can figure out what words go in each of those closed statements there. Let's pause and process. Take a look. Here are your answers. Provide external supports, external models, number 1. The brain naturally likes to chunk information, that's number 2. The brain, number 3, the brain becomes overwhelmed pretty quickly, so provide one step at a time directions. By the way, for those of you who have your own children at home, it works as well. Instead of telling your 7-year-old, go clean up your room, that's too overwhelming, tell that 7-year-old, first task, here's all you need to do. Just one simple thing, go take all your dirty clothes and put them in the laundry room. When you're done, come back and see me. Instead of saying something like clean up your room, which is overwhelming, give them one direction at a time. Nice things happen. Does it take longer? Yes, but are you going to be happier? Is the student going to be, your kid going to be a little bit more happier, a little bit more energetic, a little bit more positive? Yes. Number 4, dopamine checklist probably help release a little bit of dopamine, and then we clear the clutter. So we reduce cognitive load, we reduce the demand we're putting on working memory, and then simultaneously, we increase cognitive capacity. In the few minutes we have left, let's see how many of these we can jump into. Cognitive capacity, here's a good definition of it. Take a look. Think of capacity this way. So I showed you my favorite unhealthy diet beverage, 12 ounces. That's the capacity of the can. So capacity is how much we can fill in there. But unlike, this allows the analogy in this sense, unlike this can, we can actually improve cognitive capacity. So if you think about it, if a student's kind of lacking some working memory capacity, we increase capacity, and then that increases success in the classroom. So a couple of ways to do that is, one is to enhance dopamine. I've introduced you to dopamine previously. That's the part of the brain, or the neurochemical in the brain, that's associated with reward and pleasure, the anticipation of a reward. And dopamine enhances working memory. So if a student's struggling, I think to myself, how can I get their brain in a better place in order to tackle the working memory challenges in front of them? Now, there's a lot of ways we can do that. Physical movement, some praise statements can probably help you feel a little bit better as well. Positive emotions, diet, there's lots of ways we can do that. Let me just show you a couple. Physical movement is a great way to enhance dopamine. In fact, let's do that together. We've been together for 45 minutes and you've all been sitting as long as I have. So let's take a quick stretch break. Everybody stand up. I'm going to stand up as well. Let me adjust my camera here. There we go. Everybody stand up. I can see you. Stand up. There you go. Let's take a moment, just stretch, kind of put the arms out, stretch just a little bit. Feel the creaks and the groans. Kind of feel your core muscles stretch just a little bit. Side note, if this is the most exercise you've had in a week, then, well, that's not good. So one way to enhance dopamine are just quick energizers, quick stretching movements. And you can do this online as well as an in-person classroom. If you think to yourself, what's coming up is going to tax their working memory, think, how can I get their working memory primed and ready to go? I might say, students, real quick, before we do this task, everybody stand up. And then maybe you pull in a Go Noodle video, or you do something to kind of get some of the energy into the body. That enhances dopamine. Dopamine enhances working memory. So feel free to stay standing or sitting, whatever works for you. It's good for me. Let me adjust my camera back down there so you're not looking over my head. A couple other ways you can enhance dopamine is to have your students give compliments, high fives, kudos, congratulations, gratitude to each other. That works. Allow standing. Standing is a form of stretching and movement. Tracking my own progress and feeling good about my progress by something like a checklist. Your feedback, your praise, your nonverbals, all of those are ways to enhance dopamine and help your students actually improve in working memory. So enhancing dopamine is a really good place to start. This next one, we're going to do a little bit longer dive into this because you're going to love what's about to come your way. We play working memory games. One of the best ways you can support working memory for your kids is to do something like playing games with them. This is really good. You're going to love this. Take a look, and then I'll give you specific strategies for working memory games. Games are a great way to improve working memory. Before I show you the strategies here in just a moment, let's step back and make a personal connection. I'm willing to bet that most of you were fairly successful in elementary school early on, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Why were many of you successful is because your parents or your family members or somebody growing up probably played games with you, checkers, chutes and ladders, or you did puzzles. Think about what something like chutes and ladders does when it comes to working memory. In order to do well at something like chutes and ladders, you have to develop some sense of a working memory. Here's my kind of challenge, and think about it this way. Many of us were successful when we got to elementary school because we had a couple of years of home experiences where we were playing games or doing connect the dots activities, or we were doing jigsaw puzzles. Those things actually created or helped create a pretty good working memory. Games are a side note. We'll talk about those in just a minute. So how might we do this in the classroom and support academics at the same time? This is a tad harder to do virtually, but it can be done with some creativity. Put students in partners. I'm going to show you an example. If we were live together, we would do this, but obviously we're not live together. Put students in partners. Partner one is going to be facing the screen. Partner two would be facing away from the screen. They could be shoulder to shoulder. They could be face to face, but one of the partners faces the screen. The other faces away from it. So only partner one in this case can see what's on the screen. So partner one says the letters out loud to their partner. Partner two then takes those three letters and creates a word with it. So partner one says ROA. Then partner two has to say ROA, or. Very good. Number two, the partner one says TCA. Partner two says cat. And then you go down the list. Think about what's happening when it comes to working memory. Remember, working memory requires that I manipulate and do something with it. In this case, partner two has to take three pieces of information and do something or create a problem or solve a problem. Now, you can't go too extreme there. It's going to be tough to go beyond about 4 or 5 letters, especially with younger students, because of the limitations of working memory. Something like that works real well. 3 letters, 4 letters, create a word. Here's another example. Again, partner one faces the screen, partner two faces away. Partner one says the word aloud, partner two spells it backwards. So partner one says tool, then partner two has to say LOOT. Then you got it. See, they're short, they're kind of fun, they're low stakes, but they're pretty powerful as well. A couple more examples. Partner one says a string of letters, partner two says the string of letters backwards. So it can be done with both numbers as well as letters. Recall that working memory consists of 2 things, sights and sounds. This is a verbal working memory activity because partner two is the one who's being challenged. Is I have to take verbal information, plop it into working memory, manipulate it, and spit it back out. And of course, you always have kids shift partners, so both partners get to play the game and kind of engage in the activity. And here's another activity or another way you can do it. This time they just come up with the sum. Partner one says, what's 99 plus 7 plus 16? You can see how it can become overwhelming pretty darn quickly, right? Quick recall as we're starting to kind of pull everything together. It's just sights and sounds. That was an example of a verbal working memory activity. And here's an example of a visual working memory activity. They're spot the difference puzzles. Have you seen these before? As a kid, you probably played them and didn't even know they were helping you develop working memory. One of the reasons you were probably pretty good at school as a young kid is because somewhere along the lines you played these quote unquote games. Something like a spot the difference puzzle. Think about what we're asking their brains to do. Is they have to look there, then they have to look there and say, oh, I already looked over there, but wait, that looks a little bit over something similar to that one. Wait, how is that one different? It's a sophisticated mental process. In case you're curious, those are some of the differences that I saw. And here's another example. If you're overwhelmed by that first example, maybe this one will be a little more up your alley. We just do this and they're just kind of fun. Kids kind of are gravitated towards these things. They're low stakes, they're kind of game oriented, but as kids get good at them, we have them do a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more in order to develop cognitive capacity. We use something like a spot the difference puzzle. In this case, this is a visual working memory task. You might ask Bryan, where do I get these? You can do a Google search and find a whole bunch of them. But this was just shared to me a couple of months ago. The Smithsonian does a daily one, which I thought was pretty darn cool. And they pull from their archive of nature photos mostly, but nature and geography and architecture, they have a spot the difference daily puzzle/game. We're improving cognitive capacity by playing games. One of the reasons you and I were probably pretty successful early on is because we played a lot of these games. Pretty darn important stuff. So even a few more strategies or ways to work around this working memory thing. Here are just some examples. Take a look. Let me elaborate just on number 5 and 6. I can elaborate. These are pretty similar in essence. So probably better in person, but let's say you put your students in a circle and you call on student number 1 and say, you're going to start a story, but you're going to start our story with one word. Then we're going to go to the person on your right, and then they're going to say your word and add one more word to the story. Then the third person is going to say the first 2 words and then add one more. We're going to go all the way around the circle and tell a story. Here's an example. The person, student number 1 says the. Person number 2, student number 2 says the bird. Student number three says the bird was. Person number 4 says the bird was small. Person number 5 says the bird was small, but, and you just keep going around until you add more and more until you get to the story. That's just where you just partner or group and you just keep adding on, you repeat and add on. Lots of different ways you can do it, and they're fun, and they do some really nice things to create working memory capacity. I mentioned Dr. Alloway earlier, 2 of her books there. This is probably a good place to go ahead and stop right there. Tons of other information to share with you. Here is one way I might start with my kids, is do this and encourage this at home as well, is just encourage families to play lots of games. And no, I'm not talking, about the games on our devices. There's a social aspect to it. But the way I grew up, we kind of played board games. Now, some of them are overwhelming, Monopoly, for example, because it takes forever to complete that game. But play games with your kids. Encourage families to do this. Jigsaw puzzles, fill in the blank games, Mad Libs, you name all of these things create working memory. The reason you and I were probably pretty successful early on in our careers is because we played lots of games like Connect 4. And we do lots of memory games. And we do flashcards, and we do all sorts of things. Here's another example. We just play games. Lots and lots of games are a way to go about supporting your students.